The morning mist hangs low over the Seine River as it winds its way through the heartland of the Frankish Empire. The year is 845, and the world's most powerful Christian kingdom is about to face a reckoning that will shake its foundations. On the horizon, barely visible through the dawn haze, dark silhouettes appear, sleek dragon-headed vessels cutting through water with unnatural speed. The Frankish sentries who first spot them have only moments to sound the alarm before these ships, these remarkable vessels of Norse engineering, change warfare in Western Europe forever. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The Frankish Empire of the 9th century stood as the unquestioned military power of Western Europe. Inheritors of Charlemagne's vision, they maintained the largest standing army on the continent, with heavily armored cavalry that could crush any opposing force in open battle. Their fortified towns and strategic river crossings were designed to control territory and movement throughout the realm. This was a kingdom built on the legacy of Roman military thinking: control the roads, control the land, and you control everything. But the Northmen, as they would come to be known in Frankish chronicles, operated by entirely different rules. They came from a harsh world of fjords and mountains, where the sea was not a barrier but a highway. For generations, Scandinavian shipbuilders had been perfecting a vessel like no other in Europe, the longship. These were not merely boats, but revolutionary machines that would transform warfare. Shallow-drafted yet seaworthy, flexible yet sturdy, these vessels represented the pinnacle of Dark Age technology. Life in the north demanded innovation. The harsh climate of Scandinavia, with its long winters and short growing seasons, created societies that valued pragmatic solutions. The Vikings were not simply warriors. They were farmers, traders, and craftsmen who had learned to navigate the challenging geography of their homeland. Their longships evolved from generations of coastal seafaring, where vessels needed to be both ocean-capable and able to navigate shallow rivers and beaches. This duality became their greatest advantage. The Norse people lived in a world dominated by the sea. Their settlements clung to coastlines and fjords, with mountains and forests limiting inland expansion. In such an environment, boats were not luxury items, but essential tools for survival, communication, and eventually, expansion. Archaeological evidence from burial sites like Oseberg and Gokstad reveals the central place these vessels held in Norse culture. They were seen as vehicles not just for this world, but for the journey to the next. Shipbuilding in Viking society was a highly specialized craft, passed down through generations of master builders. Without formal blueprints or engineering drawings, these craftsmen relied on experience and oral tradition to create vessels of remarkable consistency and quality. Each longship represented an enormous investment of resources for a pre-industrial society, up to 11 tons of oak timber, thousands of iron rivets, hundreds of yards of woolen sailcloth, and months of skilled labor. The longship itself was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, built using the clinker technique, where wooden planks overlapped each other and were secured with iron rivets. These vessels combined flexibility and strength. Each ship required thousands of iron nails, hundreds of oak planks, and a single massive tree for the keel. The shallow draft, sometimes as little as 20 inches, allowed these warships to navigate rivers that no other seagoing vessel could approach. Their symmetrical design, with identical bow and stern, meant they could reverse direction without turning around, a tactical advantage in narrow waterways. Most revolutionary was the combination of sail and oars. Previous ships in Europe specialized in one or the other, but Viking longships mastered both. On the open ocean, their square sail caught the wind, allowing crews to conserve energy for the raids to come. When approaching targets or navigating rivers, they could lower the sail and row with precision and speed. This dual propulsion system gave them unprecedented tactical flexibility. The construction process began with the laying of the keel, a single piece of oak, often exceeding 70 feet in length for the largest vessels. This backbone of the ship was shaped from a single tree, carefully selected and worked with axes to achieve the graceful curve that would define the vessel's performance in water. Onto this keel, shipwrights attached the stems at bow and stern, creating the distinctive profile that would strike fear into coastal communities throughout Europe. The hull planks, each split radially from oak logs to maximize strength, were overlapped and riveted together in the clinker technique. This method created a hull that could flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. Between the planks, tarred wool or animal hair was pressed as caulking to ensure watertightness. As the hull took shape, internal framing was added for structural support, but with remarkable economy, just enough to strengthen the hull without adding unnecessary weight. The combination of lightweight and structural integrity gave these ships unmatched performance. A typical longship could achieve speeds of 10 to 15 knots under sail in favorable conditions and maintain 5-6 knots under oar power for extended periods. This outpaced any contemporary vessel and, crucially, was faster than messengers could travel by land with warnings of their approach. By the early 9th century, population pressure and political consolidation in Scandinavia pushed many warriors and adventurers to seek opportunity elsewhere. The Norwegian and Danish coasts were becoming crowded as local kings consolidated power. For ambitious men with few prospects at home, the wealthy, divided kingdoms to the south offered tempting targets. What began as small raids evolved into a systematic campaign of exploration and exploitation. The rivers of Europe became highways for these northern predators. The Frankish Empire had grown complacent in its power. Its military strategy relied on heavy cavalry and infantry that could dominate the battlefield in pitched battles. Their defenses were concentrated at major road junctions and traditional invasion routes. Rivers were seen as natural barriers, not avenues of attack. The empire's vastness became its vulnerability, impossible to defend everywhere at once, especially against an enemy that could appear without warning deep within its territory. The traditional Frankish response to invasion was methodical mobilization. Upon receiving news of a threat, local counts would raise their forces, messengers would be dispatched to neighboring regions, and eventually a formidable army would assemble. This system had proven effective against conventional enemies like the Saxons or Avars, who moved predictably along known routes. But the longships rendered this entire system obsolete. By the time Frankish forces mobilized, the Viking raiders could be 100 miles away, attacking a different target or already returning to their ships with plunder. The Franks had invested heavily in a system of fortified bridges and toll stations along major roads. These controlled movement throughout the empire and generated substantial revenue. But these expensive fortifications proved largely irrelevant against an enemy that traveled by water, not road. The empire's entire strategic thinking had been built around controlling land routes, leaving their waterways as an exposed flank. The summer of 845 marked a turning point. A fleet of 120 longships sailed up the Seine River under the command of a chieftain named Ragnar. The Frankish defensive system, designed to counter land-based threats, proved utterly ineffective against this maritime assault. Viking crews could row upriver against the current at 5 knots, faster than a man could run with news of their approach. Within days, they had penetrated hundreds of miles into the heart of the empire, bypassing fortifications that had never been tested from the riverside. The moment of true shock came when these northern raiders reached Paris itself on Easter Sunday. The city that considered itself the heir to Rome now faced warriors from beyond the edge of the civilized world. According to the Annals of Saint-Bertin, one of our most reliable sources for this period, the Frankish defenders were paralyzed with indecision. Their armies, designed for set-piece battles on open ground, had no effective response to an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Emperor Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, found himself in an unthinkable position, paying 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to make the raiders leave. For a proud empire that had dominated European politics for generations, this humiliation burned deeply. The payment, recorded in contemporary chronicles as the first major Danegeld, established a dangerous precedent. It proved that the longship-born raiders could strike at will, even against the mightiest kingdoms. The Vikings' operational method exposed the fundamental weakness in the Frankish system. The raiders did not need to defeat the Frankish army in battle. They simply avoided it altogether. By the time heavy Frankish cavalry arrived at one raided settlement, the longships had moved on to the next target. The empire's military strength became almost irrelevant against an enemy that refused to engage on conventional terms. Frankish chroniclers recorded their shock at the unprecedented mobility of these northern raiders. The Annals of St. Vast describe with disbelief how Viking forces could strike at dawn, be gone by midday, and attack a location 50 miles away by the next morning. This operational tempo was simply beyond anything European warfare had previously experienced. The longship had compressed both time and space, rendering traditional response mechanisms obsolete. The cultural collision was as significant as the military one. The Franks, with their hierarchical society and formal military traditions, struggled to comprehend these northern adversaries who seemed to follow no recognizable rules of warfare. The Vikings did not seek to control territory or establish permanent garrisons. They struck, gathered wealth, and disappeared back to their ships before a response could be organized. This mobility fundamentally challenged the Frankish concept of power, which was rooted in land ownership and fixed fortifications. The psychological impact rippled through Frankish society. Churches added a new line to their litanies: "From the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us." River towns that had never considered themselves vulnerable now faced an existential threat. The empire's inability to protect its heartland undermined the very foundation of the feudal contract, the promise of security in exchange for loyalty and taxes. Confidence in imperial power eroded with each successful raid. Archaeological evidence supports the written records of this period. Excavations at Frankish settlements along major rivers show layers of ash and sudden abandonment in the mid-9th century. Hoards of buried valuables, never reclaimed by their owners, tell silent stories of communities disrupted by violence. The material record reveals a pattern of settlement retreat, with populations moving away from exposed riverbanks to more defensible inland locations. The Norse advantage was not merely technological, but psychological. Viking crews, operating far from home in hostile territory, maintained tight unit cohesion and discipline. Contemporary accounts describe their ability to assemble and disassemble shore camps with remarkable speed, always maintaining a ready path of retreat to their vessels. This operational security contrasted sharply with the cumbersome Frankish military system, which required extensive logistics and preparation before engaging enemies. In the aftermath of the Paris raid, Frankish leaders scrambled to adapt. The Edict of Meersen in 847 ordered the construction of river defenses and bridges designed to block longship passage. Local counts were commanded to raise defense forces specifically to counter these maritime threats. But adaptation came slowly to an empire bound by tradition and bureaucracy. The longships continued to exploit the waterways of France for decades to come. The Frankish response eventually took physical form in a new type of fortification, the circular stone tower. Unlike earlier rectangular designs, these structures presented no corners that could be undermined by attackers. They were specifically positioned to command river approaches and provide early warning of longship fleets. The remnants of these watchtowers still dot the landscapes of France and Germany today. Silent witnesses to a revolution in warfare brought by northern shipwrights. Medieval chroniclers struggled to explain this new threat. Some, like the monk Ermentarius of Noirmoutier, saw the Vikings as a divine punishment for the sins of the Frankish people. Others, more pragmatic, documented the revolutionary impact of the longship on warfare. The annals of Fulda noted with grudging admiration how these northern vessels could appear like birds, swiftly and unexpectedly. The very identity of the Frankish realm as a secure Christian kingdom was shaken to its core. The longship's legacy extended far beyond that single summer. As raids continued, the Frankish Empire began to fragment. Local nobles, finding central authority unable to protect them, built their own defenses and raised their own armies. This decentralization accelerated the transition from the Carolingian Empire to the feudal system that would characterize medieval Europe. Political power devolved to those who could offer immediate protection against these waterborne threats. What made the longship so revolutionary was not just its technical specifications, but how it connected previously separate theaters of war. Before the Vikings, coastal regions and river valleys were distinct strategic zones. The longship erased this distinction, allowing raiders to strike deep inland with the same force they brought to coastal targets. Military planners now had to consider every waterway as a potential invasion route, a defensive nightmare that stretched resources to the breaking point. The transformation of European warfare happened with remarkable speed. Within a generation of the 845 raid on Paris, fortified bridges spanned major rivers. New fortifications, specifically designed to counter Viking tactics, appeared at river junctions. The circular stone keeps that would become emblematic of medieval castles evolved partly in response to the Viking threat, providing refuge against raiders who relied on speed rather than siege equipment. The longship itself continued to evolve during this period. Archaeological finds reveal how shipbuilders refined their designs in response to defensive measures. Later longships featured greater length-to-width ratios, improving speed and ocean worthiness. These modifications allowed Viking crews to undertake even longer voyages, reaching as far as North America by the early 11th century. The technological revolution that had begun in Scandinavian fjords ultimately connected continents. As decades passed, the threat evolved. Some Viking bands began to settle in the territories they had once raided. In 911, a Viking leader named Rollo received the territory that would become Normandy, transforming raiders into landholders with a stake in local security. The very success of the longship strategy eventually led to its decline, as former Vikings now defended the rivers they had once exploited. The predators became protectors. By the late 10th century, the technological advantage of the longship had been partly neutralized by adaptive defenses and changing political realities. But its impact on European history was indelible. The modern nations of France, England, and Germany all took shape partly in response to the pressures created by these northern raiders and their revolutionary vessels. Political fragmentation, accelerated by the Viking incursions, created the patchwork of territories that would define medieval Europe. Today, modern replicas of Viking longships have confirmed what medieval chronicles described. These vessels can indeed navigate both open seas and shallow rivers with remarkable efficiency. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated their speed, maneuverability, and versatility. What seemed like fantastical exaggerations in medieval sources has proven to be technological reality. The longship was indeed centuries ahead of its time in its approach to naval design. The legacy of these remarkable vessels extends into our modern understanding of technology and warfare. They remind us that true military revolutions often come not from incremental improvements to existing systems, but from approaches that change the fundamental rules of engagement. The longship did not simply outperform other ships of its era. It rendered entire defensive systems obsolete by exploiting an environmental domain that others had neglected. For the Franks of the 9th century, the appearance of dragon-headed ships on their rivers represented more than just a military threat. It was a collision between different worldviews, one based on controlling territory through fixed positions, the other on exploiting mobility and surprise. The psychological impact of these raids, preserved in contemporary accounts, reveals a society forced to reconsider its most basic assumptions about security and power. As the mist lifts from our historical journey, we can see how a single summer's events along the Seine set in motion changes that would reshape Western Europe. The Longship, with its revolutionary design and capabilities, did not merely defeat Frankish armies, it challenged and transformed an entire concept of warfare. In the waters of the Seine, as Vikings accepted payment to spare Paris, one era of European military thinking ended and another began. When we speak of technological revolutions in warfare, we often focus on gunpowder, the airplane, or nuclear weapons. But the Viking longship deserves its place among these world-changing innovations. In a single generation, it rendered obsolete military systems that had evolved over centuries. The shallow-drafted vessel from the north did not just transport warriors, it carried with it a new paradigm that would reshape the political and military landscape of an entire continent. The quiet waters of Europe's rivers, once seen as barriers to invasion, had been transformed into highways for a new kind of warfare. As the longships returned northward, heavy with Frankish silver, they left behind a changed world, one that would never again underestimate the threat from the sea or the ingenuity of the men who sailed from the north.